I remember it well. It was an overnight ferry from the city of Arkhangelsk in the far north of Russia to the Solovetsky Islands. These islands were the site of the first, really the first camp of the Gulag, the Soviet Union's first major political camp that was actually run by the secret police. And I, of course, was going to see a concentration camp, and most of the people on the ship were there because it was a kind of pleasure cruise. The islands are very beautiful, and they were there to sort of have a good time. And we were all assigned tables, and I sat with a group of people who were from a city down the river. And they asked me, they found it very amusing that they had an American on the boat. And they said to me, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm writing a book about Soviet concentration camps, and I'm going to see the Solovetsky Islands for that reason." And there was a kind of dead silence and a real moment of unpleasantness as they said, one of them said, "Well, what business is it of yours? Why do you care about it? This is our problem, not yours." And another person said, one of the other ones said, "Well, why don't you write about something nice in our history? We went to the moon," and meaning we, the Soviet Union, even though the Soviet Union no longer existed. And you foreigners always focus on the bad things. One of the women said, "No, you're right. I think it's an interesting thing that you're doing, and it's worthwhile." And another one never said anything at all, just sat listening quietly as I tried to describe my trip. And it's the reason I use this incident in the book is it struck me as very typical of the wide range of reactions, contemporary Russian reactions to this kind of history. Some people become angry about it, some people don't want to know about it. A few people consider it important and wish they knew more, and most people would just rather not talk about it at all. All of the 90% of what's written about it is written in Russian. All the archives are in Russian. I had to conduct interviews in Russian. To understand the nuances of it. It may be that my Russian, it was certainly enough to do that. But it's a very nuanced and complicated history, and you would have to be able to speak to people about it. It's complicated because there have been two moments in Russian history when they did talk about it publicly. One was right after Stalin died. There was a very brief moment when it was sort of half discussed in the Khrushchev era, and then sort of quickly buried again after Khrushchev fell. Then in the mid-1980s, when Perestroika began, in the year of Glasnost, there began to be a public debate as well, and Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the first great book on the Soviet camps, was published, and there was a great interest in the past. And that ended then very quickly. And by the time I was going to Russia in the 90s, people had really lost interest in the subject, and I think what is particularly important is that there was no official interest in it. And when I compare it to Germany after the war, Germany after the war held trials. There was a constant debate. Nowadays, there are museums. In Russia, there's none of that. There's a sort of official silence. Occasionally, a little bit of money given to victims, but there's no real public acceptance of responsibility for what happened, and that is very different. It's an acronym, and it means main camp system, main camp administrative system. The word was popularized by Solzhenitsyn, who took the acronym which describes the administrative body that ran the Gulag and used it to describe the camp system. The Gulag was a system of concentration camps and administration of camps. The most comprehensive count we have is something like 476 camps. Each camp, though, was a camp complex, could contain up to many thousands of smaller camps. It was a network of prison labor that stretched all across the Soviet Union. It really, some form of it existed from 1918 until the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, but the really important years were from about 1929 until Stalin's death in 1953. And those were the years when the Gulag was a very important part of the Soviet economy and contributed an enormous amount to the Soviet mentality. There were camps before that and there were camps after that, but they didn't have quite the same significance. It started for several reasons, but I suppose the most important reason was that Stalin was, in 1929, was carrying out something called the 5-year plan, which was an attempt to industrialize the Soviet Union very quickly. And one of the side effects of the 5-year plan was that a great number of people were arrested. And there was, during a process called collectivization, when the Soviet farms were made into state farms, peasants were made into state farms, many, many people were arrested. This meant that they had an enormous number of prisoners. They wanted to industrialize. Stalin came up with came up with the idea that that we could use prison labor to speed up industrialization. And it was a combination of both of those things. Those numbers you have to be very careful with, because in fact the camp system was in constant flux. There were waves of arrests and then waves of releases. People were released for all kinds of reasons. They were released into the Red Army during the war. They were released because the system decided it had too many people, so it let pregnant women out, or there were various reasons. Those numbers represent the average, the official total number of people in camps in that particular year, on January the 1st of that particular year. If you add up altogether number of people who were in the camps at one point or another, you get much higher numbers. You get 15, 18 million. There were some big years in the early 30s when this wave of peasants came into the camps. There was another spike in 1937. This was the year of the so-called Great Purge, when Stalin and his henchmen began arresting high party members. And there was an enormous wave just after the war. And after the war, you had pouring into the camps, you had people from the territories that the Soviet Union had conquered. You had Russians who'd fought in the West being arrested upon their return to Russia. Soviet citizens returning to the Soviet Union. You had enormous new categories of prisoners in those years. 1948 is another year when Stalin once again began to, there was a sort of slightly looser feeling after the war, he once again clamped down. And that was another year of mass arrests. It was connected to ideology, it was connected to international politics, the waves of arrests. I did formal interviews of about 30 people, meaning that I sat down with them for several hours and recorded interviews. I probably talked to twice that number. I mean, I've met maybe 50, 60, 70 people, because I met people all over the place who had some experience, or who, if they hadn't been specifically in camps, had been in exile, which was another form of mass repression and punishment. So many people, I met people in other countries too who had been in the Soviet system, Hungarians, Poles, who'd been in the Soviet camps. Susanna Pechora is a woman who was very unusual in the Soviet Union in that she was actually part of a very small, very amateurish, but very authentic anti-Stalinist group. There was virtually no opposition in the Soviet Union. There was no mass opposition until much later on. And in Stalin's era, there was nothing. She, together with a little group of school friends, I mean, they were sort of 17, 18, founded what they just thought of as a kind of revolutionary group. There were a few. Then they established a kind of system of secrecy, and they had meetings. I don't think they did very much. But one of them betrayed the whole group to the secret police, and they were all arrested. They were sent all over the Soviet Union. One or two of them were executed. She was sent to the far north to one of the most difficult camps. What's amazing about Susanna Pechora is that she never lost her energy or her enthusiasm or her belief that the Soviet system was wrong. They didn't beat it out of her. She never had any difficulty afterwards talking about what had happened. As soon as it became possible in the 1980s, she became one of the founders of Memorial, which was, and is today, the only organization that is truly preoccupied with the history of the camps and the history of Stalinism in Russia. She now lives in Moscow. She was not in very long because she was arrested late. It was in the 50s. She was actually in camps for, I think, 5-6 years. It was, I think one of the things she said to me was she was very young. And in that sense, she regrets it. She was, for example, before she was in the camp, she was in prison for a long time. And she said to me, when you're a young person, you don't have resources to draw on. You don't have memories. You don't have things to think about. And so for her, it was an experience of, solitary was, she had to sort of figure out who she was and come up with things to think of and tell herself stories. It was an experience that I suppose could have it made her more of what she was. I suppose it made her. She knew there was something. She sensed there was something wrong with the system, and it made her more so. It gave her a kind of conviction. It's not the only thing that led to the book, but I saw people selling little Lenin and Stalin pins, and I saw lots of foreign tourists buying them. They were the sort of kind of communist bric-a-brac that used to be available quite easily in the Soviet Union, sort of Red Army caps with stars on them and belts, Soviet Army belts, and little pins and with pictures of Lenin and Stalin. And I just looked at that and I thought, if this was Nazi memorabilia for sale, nobody would buy it. And it was that sort of that's an incident that I use as representative of other experiences I've had that have led me to realize that the experience of the Gulag doesn't have the same significance for us in the West, or really, in some cases, any significance for us that the Nazi experience had. And there are good reasons for that. But it led me to become intrigued with the subject and follow it further. I spent a long time in that part of the world. I was originally, the first thing I did as a grown-up was to go to Warsaw and be the Warsaw correspondent for The Economist. And that was in 1989. I had been in university in England at Oxford. I had studied Russian in college. I had been to Eastern Europe a couple of times. I was actually involved with a group that was helping to fund some of the dissident movements in Warsaw. It doesn't have a name. I mean, it was run out of England. It's not a secret anymore, but it was just sort of sympathizers with the dissident movement. It was run by a group of Oxford students, really, and one of them was a friend of mine who was all involved in Poland in particular, and he asked me if I'd like to go at one time and bring money to some of the people, and I did it. Not long. I mean, this wasn't until about 1988, which was really the end, and everything was already falling apart, and so on. I just went back and forth a couple of times. My book. Yes, my book I began a few years after that. I mean, I didn't really begin working on it until much towards the end of the 90s, and by that time, there was a tremendous amount of information available. Most importantly, the Soviet archives are open. They're not all open. There's probably still a lot of personal information on Stalin and the leadership that's not open. But there's a tremendous amount that is open. And there are a tremendous number of people, particularly in Russia, who've been working on it. And that's all new. I didn't live, well, by the time I was doing it, it was Russia, not the Soviet Union. I didn't live there. I lived in Warsaw, and I went back and forth. I would spend a month here and a month there. And go back and forth. I did. That's why I was in Warsaw, actually, for the last few years. So I was married to him, and he was the deputy foreign minister. He's at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. A part of the American left. I don't think all of the American left. It's not fair to say. Also, of course, it's been different at different times in history, and right now, it's probably pretty hard to find anybody, even on the far left, who would think that the Soviet Union was a nice place. I mean, you do meet one or two, but yes, there is a long history of, if not exactly covering up Stalinist crimes, then wanting to downplay them. Really, it wasn't so much this in this country Stalinists versus pro-Stalinists versus anti-Stalinists, but rather people who were very anti-Stalinist against people who were nervous about America's role in the Cold War, and never wanted to play up Soviet crimes because that would somehow justify America's role in the Cold War. And it really became, the whole subject of the Soviet Union became politicized, and the study of the history of the Soviet Union became politicized, which was another reason why it was so difficult to write in the past and is so much easier to write now. The Gulag began in the first camps were founded directly after the Bolshevik Revolution by Lenin. under his order, he and Trotsky ordered the setting up of camps for enemies of the people and people who were in the way of the revolution. And this was right at the beginning in 1918. There were camps for enemies of various kinds throughout the 1920s. In 1929, however, Stalin took a decision to expand the camp system and to make it a far more important part of the Soviet economy. And he began to use the camps for particular economic goals, to dig the White Sea Canal or to dig for coal in the far north. And it was particularly used in bits of the Soviet Union that were almost uninhabitable, the very, very far north or the deserts, where prison labor, you didn't have to entice people to go there. Prisoners could be forced to go there and work while people were arrested. Well, the Gulag was partly for political prisoners. And by political prisoners in the Soviet Union, I mean people who were arrested on spurious political charges 99% of the time. So they would tell a joke about Stalin, and then they would be arrested for being counter-revolutionaries. Or their neighbor, wanted to get hold of their apartment, so the neighbor would accuse them of committing treason, and then they would be arrested for treason. Throughout the 30s and 40s, there was a sort of a climate of paranoia and unreasonability that's difficult to explain today, where crossing any line or being thought to have crossed any line, criticizing the authorities in any way could result in a camp sentence. There were also criminals in the camps. There was also a third category of prisoner. The Soviet Union had very, very strict work laws. So if you were late to work too many times, you could be arrested. This was particularly true during the war. If you switched your place of work without telling the authorities, you could be arrested. And there were people sent to the camps for those kinds of reasons too. There was an extremely wide range of people there from all social classes, all walks of life. They were everywhere. There were camps in Moscow. After the war, large parts of Moscow were built and rebuilt by prisoners. There were camps all over the far north where there were oil mines, oil fields and coal mines. Pretty much every major city had a camp. Pretty much every province had a camp or a group of prisons. It would have been hard to live your life in the Soviet Union, to go through daily life and not be aware of the camps. They varied tremendously. There were some sort of industrial-sized camps which contained tens of thousands of people. There were some very small ones connected to particular factories or particular workshops that might just be a few dozen people. Well, here's a person who would be interesting to this audience, I think, who I didn't speak to, but who wrote a very, very good autobiography. And he was somebody called Alexander Dolgin. And he was an American who worked for the American embassy in Moscow, who was picked up off the street in 1946. He was very young, he was in his 20s, and he was a sort of very high-spirited young man who used to steal his superiors' cars, drive around Moscow, pick up girls, and so on. And because of this, the KGB suspected that he was in fact more senior than his post. He was a clerk, would otherwise have indicated, and they thought he was a spy. This was just the very beginning of the Cold War. World War II is over. Yeah. The Cold War is beginning, and the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union that had lasted through the war was beginning to freeze. As the Soviet Union had marched into Eastern Europe and appeared not to be staying, as it opposed America and various other places. It has to be said that the Soviet hysteria and fear of Americans who lived in their country never ended during the war, even during the alliance, even when we were allies. But after the war, that paranoia became much sharper and harsher. This was Alexander Dolgin. He was a young man, and he was picked up off the street. He was walking down the street, and someone said, "Hey, Alexander," and he turned around, and someone said, "Come here with me," and he was pulled into a car and driven away. He never had time to talk to his embassy. He never had time to tell anybody where he was going. He just disappeared. He was taken immediately to one of Moscow's harshest prisons, where he was interrogated for several months. His experience was in some ways unusual because he was arrested. He was genuinely thought to be a spy, and that they thought he really might be a spy. So he was interrogated with great seriousness. And he was beaten, and he was kept up all night. He was not allowed to sleep. He was tortured during interrogation. At other times, people were arrested when in times of mass arrest. Often it was very perfunctory. People would just be arrested, stamp, sent away without much investigation. He was arrested. He was then put on a train, and these trains there were several different kinds of train, but the most common kind of train was really just a cattle car. It was an empty box car. They would put 30 men in the car. There would be a hole in the bottom of the car to use as a toilet. They would be given virtually no food except for dry bread and salt fish. The great torment of the transport was actually that they were given very little water. So he was taken, very little food, very little water, and he was taken to Kolyma, which was in the very, very far east of the Soviet Union. It's on the Pacific coast, and it also happens to be a place where there are gold mines, as well as uranium and all kinds of other minerals. So he was taken there. As far as I recall, he was there for a good decade, because he was there until well after Stalin's death. Well, they would chip other holes. They would use somebody's shirt. There were not the prisoners being taken to camps, but there were mixed carriages of people who were being deported. This is another category of arrest, because you could be arrested and sent to a camp, or you could be arrested and sent to live in an exile village. And the cars to the exile villages were full of men and women and children. And these were particularly horrific. Small children got sick. They were unable to get aspirin. They got high fevers. They died. Old people were unable to walk. They were incontinent. They died. The bodies would be taken out and buried or left by the side of the train track. I'm sure there were. I'm not sure I've read a memoir describing that. That was to get people in the trucks. To get people into the trucks to go to the train station. They would get so many people in. They would make the men sit with their legs apart and each sat one in front of the other, so that, like sardines, they would be all lined up to get more people into a small space. I'm not sure they actually transported people for days and days like that, but that was a method of getting lots of people into a truck to take them to the train station. So you could be there for a couple of days. He wrote memoirs, which were actually published in this country 20 years ago. There are a lot that haven't been published. There are a lot that exist only in foreign languages. I read Polish as well as Russian, and there are Polish and Russian memoirs that haven't been translated. There are different people who collect them. In Moscow, there are a couple of sort of private libraries. One by this organization, Memorial, collects memoirs. People gave them to me. I traveled around the country a lot. I was often given memoirs, either by people I met, or there would be a local memorial group who would give me the local memoirs. There are little local libraries that have them. The archives are the main difference. I mean, he also had many memoirs. I probably have a wider range of memoirs because more are available now than they were to him. The big difference is that I am able to use both memoirs and archives so that I can show what the official line was, as well as what people were experiencing. It makes my book a different kind of book. I don't know that it's better or more valuable, but it shows other facets of life that he was unable to show. The importance of his book was really the timing of it and the monumentality of it, that it was produced at a time when the Soviet Union was still closed, when few people in the West really knew this story, and it was eye-opening for millions of people. My book is not that, because we do know this story already, but it does contain material and points of view that he wouldn't have been able to have. Well, he didn't publish it in Russia. It was published in the West. It was smuggled out. And it was published in the West in the 70s in 3 parts, and it was not published in the Soviet Union until the late 1980s, after Gorbachev's glasnost. He was expelled. He was actually kicked out of the Soviet Union for writing the Gulag book. I think it was 1976. He went back recently. He went back in the last few years, and he lives there now. 18 million is my guess, really, of how many people went through the camp system between 1918 and the end of the Soviet Union. And that takes into account the numbers that we were talking about before, the yearly numbers, as well as accounting for turnover. The 6 million number is actually quite a good number with lots of archival evidence behind it, which is how many people were deported. That means people who were arrested and sent to exile communities. They weren't put to camps. They were sent to distant villages in the far north or in the Kazakh desert to live. And this included the Chechens. Pretty much the entire Chechen nation was deported during the war. Stalin thought they were an enemy nation. There were several other nations like this, the Crimean Tatars, the Volga Germans who lived on the Volga. This included the kulaks, which are these are the peasants who came from the collectivized farms in the early 1930s, late 1920s, who were removed from their farms and sent away because it was felt that they were hampering the progress of collective agriculture. And the process of deportation was in some ways almost as horrific as being sent to a camp, because you were put in a village and you were not given any food or any money, or sometimes there wasn't even a village there. You were told to build it. And it was a very isolated place where you knew nobody, and many people died there as well. Stalin believed very deeply, and there's a lot of evidence for this, that the camps were economically productive, and that he was making money out of them. And he retained till the very end of his life in fascination with how much gold they were producing, how much oil they were producing, how much he was getting out of them. There's, of course, now lots of evidence that shows that precisely the opposite was true. The camps were not productive. They were tremendously wasteful. They were very badly run. When you have prison labor instead of specialists, you aren't able to run. I mean, these were very sophisticated enterprises, coal mines and chemical factories, and they were because they were run effectively by slave laborers. They tended not to be run particularly well. There's an interesting example, which is the city of Vorkuta. This is a coal mining city in the very far north of the Arctic Circle. Now, Vorkuta is a city that shouldn't exist. When you have that kind of coal deposit somewhere like Canada, what the Canadians would do would be to send in a team of miners. They would work for 2 weeks. This is in the permafrost, and then send them home for 2 weeks, and then rotate and send another 2 weeks. Instead of doing that, instead of running the coal mines, it's a terribly unpleasant place to live, Stalin actually built a city north of the Arctic Circle. Heating this city now costs more than the value of the coal that is dug up by the mines there. It is actually a pointless city. I mean, it has a university, it has kindergartens, and this is in a part of the world where it's dark 6 months of the year and cold for 10 months of the year, and snow for 8 months of the year. It was a misdevelopment of the Soviet Union, and it was made possible by slave labor, because he could just send prisoners up there, tell them to build a city, and they had to build it. Everybody knew the camps existed. I don't think it isn't like Nazi Germany, where there seemed to have been people who genuinely didn't know about the camps. They were so much a part of life, and people were so aware of them that they knew. How many people knew the stunning stories of what happened? That it's harder to say. Certainly, Solzhenitsyn's book was a revelation to many people in the Soviet Union when it was published in the 70s. Because people in Stalin's era didn't necessarily tell their children what had happened. Even people who'd been in the camps came back and didn't necessarily tell their families what had happened. People were really afraid to talk to each other. So I think probably the answer is that I can't give you a number, but I wouldn't say that a majority of people knew very much about what had actually happened there. Those are pictures of Polish children. Actually, those are children of deportees. Those are children who were taken from their homes and sent to communities in the far north, where, as I've just described, they had very little to eat, and their parents often died. And these pictures were taken at the end of the war, during the war, really, when the Poles were allowed to go out. On the other side, the picture on the top is a camp maternity hospital. There were babies born in the camps. Men and women were supposed to be kept separate, but they weren't. And the men, they were often mixed, either through slobbiness or through the men would actually break into the women's camps. And there were a tremendous number of babies born in the camps. And that's what the top picture is. The bottom picture is a really extraordinary picture. It may not seem so at first, but it was given to me by a woman who worked in a camp orphanage. And she gave me this picture as a way of showing me she was defending her job that she'd had. And she said that the children in the orphanage were really very happy. And this was their Christmas tree. And they were decorating a tree, so life wasn't so terribly bad. That's actually that's an interesting picture too. That's actually a picture from the official NKVD, meaning the Secret Police Archives, and that was a propaganda picture. So you see everybody in the picture seems to be very well clothed, and they're sitting very neatly and posing for the camera. If you read accounts of barracks, it was usually far more chaotic than that. There would have been clothes hanging from the ceiling, clothes drying on the beds, and so on. But that, I think, gives you some idea of how many people were in one place. I think that's from Vorkuta. That's also from Vorkuta. There were, of course, within the camps, there were ways of punishing people who disobeyed or who failed to fulfill the norm or who failed to work as hard as they were supposed to work, and they would be put into special isolation cells, and that's what that's a picture of. That's also from the official archives. That's an official picture. You know, it's a funny thing. You become immune to it. You read so many of these stories that you become very clinical about it, and you stop feeling very much, and then suddenly some story will unexpectedly shock you. I think the things that were hardest for me were the stories about children. Either children whose mothers were suddenly taken away and were left alone in apartments, or children who were born in camps. And those are very, very hard stories to read. That's a quotation from somebody's memoir. There was a shortage of everything in camps, including silverware and cutlery and bowls. And people would make bowls, people would steal bowls, people would share bowls, and people, it was considered a great advantage to have your own, because then you could go first to the front of the line instead of waiting and begging for somebody else's bowl. That's another quotation from a memoir, and that is a photograph of a criminal, somebody who was part of the professional criminal gangs that were very influential and important in the camps. And their bodies were often completely covered with tattoos. And that's a doctor examining a prisoner with a tattoo. The picture on the shower is a camp bath. Again, that's a relatively, compared to some of the descriptions of the baths, that's not such a bad picture. It's not very crowded, but the baths were really just rooms with bowls of water on the floor, and they would have to wash themselves using those. That's actually a hospital. Those are sick men, and again, these are all official photographs taken by the secret police and kept in secret police archives until recently. In the secret police archives, which are now, actually they're still there, but you can see them now. They gave me a fellowship. I spent a month there. I used their archives for a month. He's very important. He's really the pioneer. He didn't write directly about the camps. What he wrote about was the Stalin's purge of his own party in 1937. That was his great book called The Great Terror. But he was really the first Western historian to focus so sharply on the issue of Soviet repression. And he did so at a time when the rest of the academic community was not so interested in this subject. I can even remember being at Yale in the 1980s, and even then, this is in the early 80s, Robert Conquest was considered a little bit iffy. He wasn't considered a really proper historian because of his obsession with Stalin's crimes. He relied very much on, because there were no archives, he relied very much on the words of émigrés, and he relied very much on accounts of people coming out of the Soviet Union. And this was considered not quite proper history. As it turned out, the émigrés were right. The stories they told were true. But there was another group of historians that preferred to use official Soviet sources, meaning Soviet newspapers or books that were officially published, to tell the history of the Soviet Union. And he simply didn't believe those sources, and he believed the personal accounts. And that was why he was so important. I don't know if he was the only American. There would have probably been other American. Might have been other official visits, but he was certainly the only person of that kind. He was actually the vice president of the United States when he went to Kolyma, which was the harshest camp. The war was still going on. We were allies with the Soviet Union, and he was completely taken in by what he saw. He believed that he was visiting something like an industrial enterprise. Local party workers were dressed up as miners so that he would see them working in the mines rather than the emaciated prisoners. Right, that was correct, because they were our allies in the war against Hitler. We liked him. Roosevelt was attracted to Stalin. Roosevelt felt that Stalin was a kindred spirit, and he even saw Stalin, the United States and the Soviet Union are new countries, and we together are, defeating this old Europe of aristocracies. I mean, this old, we are the new countries, the countries of the future. He was really comprehensively taken in. I think he later took some of that back when he realized what had happened, but he felt he was visiting our ally during the war. He was visiting their great industrial enterprise, the gold fields, and the Soviets put on an immense show for him. I mean, there are actually Soviet archives now describing this visit. And they put an enormous effort on. They put hundreds of people into making sure that everything he saw was kosher, that everything that he saw only the absolute best. He was treated to amazing meals. He was given the tour by Nikishov, who was the secret police chief commander of that particular camp, whom I think Wallace described as something like a CEO. I mean, he didn't understand who it was that he was meeting, and he was simply given false information from the beginning to the end. And every step of the way, reports about his progress and what he'd seen and done were sent back to Moscow and are now in the archives. Putin was a member of the secret police, which was later called the KGB, as we know, and the old name, the Leninist era name for the KGB, is the Cheka. And Putin has described himself as a Chekist, which is an old-fashioned word for secret policeman. The first time I heard him say it, it filled me with horror. I mean, it's like somebody saying, and I was a brown shirt. I mean, it has very unpleasant connotations. He says it because it gives him an aura of invincibility. We are the superior power. We were the group of people behind the scenes who were running the old Soviet Union. The term still commands, I shouldn't hide this, I mean, it still commands a certain amount of respect in Russia. I think a poll was done very recently saying that some 60 or 70% of Russians still think Lenin was a great man and contributed to their country. So he's echoing sort of the kind of respect for the Russian Revolution and what it achieved or didn't achieve. I would say a great deal. The Stalinist regime and later the Khrushchevite and Brezhnevite regimes in the Soviet Union actually spread their techniques, and they taught people around the world how to run police states. I have no doubt that there was East German usually. They used the East Germans to do that. Saddam Hussein's police state was probably set up at some point with Russian or Soviet advice. It is not an accident that so many of these systems share so much in common. I mean, there was a set of techniques. They were deliberately spread. The way the Soviet camp was exported to China, the Chinese exported it to North Korea. The North Korean Gulag, the North Korean concentration camps that exist today, sound, from what little we know of them, very like Stalin's Gulag. That's a hard number because you have to ask, I have to know what you mean by that, and that murdered during the Revolution, the Civil War, during the famine. There was an enormous famine in the 1930s that was partly caused, or 99% caused, by Stalin's agricultural policies. I mean, if you add all the many ways in which, as Bob Conquest used to say, people died of natural deaths, you don't get an exact number, but you do get something between 15 and 20 million. They believed there were people, well, some people were following orders. Some people believe they were creating paradise on Earth. You can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. You can't get to the perfect society without eliminating the enemies, and that's what they believed they were doing. You have to be very careful making judgments about why people did what they did, because you have to go back and try and read their minds, and it's difficult. Yes, it was a picture that somehow somebody who was in a camp got hold of, and she brought that picture back. And that's from her collection that she then gave to a memorial in Moscow. So those were the people who ran the camp that she was in. And many people died in that camp. You mean where prisoners were punished? It was often if you refused to work, that was the primary one. If you disobeyed the guards, if you attempted to escape, if you broke one of the myriad rules. If you were, I mean, there were all kinds of things that were illegal. Male, female fraternization was illegal. There were many things that could get you into a prison cell. Those are the armed guards. the armed guards were not part of the camp hierarchy, in that they were not secret policemen. They tended to be sort of more like they were often soldiers recruited. They were very young, and they ranged enormously in their personality. I mean, some of them helped prisoners, some of them didn't. Most of them, probably 95% of them, were indifferent. And they were the ones who walked around the rim of the camp and made sure nobody escaped. Jogota they called him the dwarf. I don't remember his exact height, but he was very short. He was the head of the secret police, which was then called the OGPU, at the very beginning of the camp system. And the picture is taken at the White Sea Canal, which was one of the first big Gulag projects. Yeah, the White Sea Canal was the first big early project. And it got the most publicity. There were many other enormous later projects. The Gulag laid most of the rail lines across the Soviet Union, across Siberia. They built the roads across Siberia. They dug the coal mines in Kolyma. They dug the coal mines and gold mines in Vorkuta. They were enormous projects. One, and it's not even one of the harshest camps. It's one Lagpunkt, which means one part of one camp called Perm 36, which was actually a camp that came to prominence in the 1980s as a sort of place where dissidents were kept, has been turned into a museum by some local people. I have been there. Perm is sort of at the foot of the Urals, kind of right in the middle of Russia. And you see the barracks, you see the fence, you see the place where people went in and out. I should say that in many other places where there have been camps, I mean, in Vorkuta, where I've also been, the coal mines, which were all built by prisoners, are all still there, and they're still coal mines. You can visit them, and you can see the places. There's a barrack or two left. They're not museums, but because they were working industrial enterprises, they're still there. It may be a little different now, but when I wrote the book, it was that. Yes, it means that the communist apparat retained an enormous amount of power even after the end of the communist system. They had all the economic power, they had tremendous amount of influence, and they were able to turn their economic power, sometimes after a hiatus when a dissident or opposition groups took over, back into political power again. And that really has been true almost everywhere. There are a number of lessons. One is the importance of memory. Knowing how this system worked, knowing how it was done, will help us understand other systems. I mean, I don't want to be too flippant and facile talking about Iraq because it happens to be in the news, or North Korea, but it really is true that this kind of system has been created over and over and over again. And it really is terribly important that we study it and we think about it and we compare these different systems. We try and understand how they came into existence, what motivates the people who ran them, in order to understand them again. And I am not one of these people who believes, if we just study it, then it will never happen again, because it will happen again. It is happening again, and it may happen many more times. And it's terribly important that we understand what happened in the past. I learned that there's no rule about that some people very frivolous, silly people suddenly find in themselves something very powerful that enables them to survive. That people who seem to be very strong and important in ordinary life are presented with the extreme of the camp situation and they collapse completely. That you never know people as well as you think you know them. People confronted with extreme circumstances, people behave in very unpredictable ways. 6 months, 8. Well, a few more. 8 members of the board plus a few other people come. Once in a while, I have to be careful when I bring up Stalin, which as I say, funnily enough, these kinds of issues about totalitarian regimes, how they're dismantled, what happens to the people who once ran them. I mean, you were asking before about former communists who took over communist countries. I mean, this will be an issue in Iraq when the Iraqi government recreates itself. What happened to the former leaders of the Ba'athist Party? Will they be in charge again? As almost inevitably has happened everywhere else. And these issues do come up in all kinds of forms at this particular moment. I have two. They are 2.5 and 5.5. No, my eldest child knows that this is my book, but he doesn't understand it. I haven't tried very hard to explain it to him. I think a really wide range of people. I think anybody who's interested in contemporary history, in the 20th century history rather, might be interested. I don't expect Russian or Soviet specialists to read it. I've deliberately written it in such a way that you don't have to be an expert in order to understand it. I've tried to explain some of what was happening in the Soviet Union at the time as a kind of background, and I hope they will also read it. But the idea of the book was that it would be accessible to people who don't have any particular background in Soviet history, although I also hope Soviet specialists will read it, and some have and have liked it. So it's my hope that they will like it too. Well, there were people who were arrested in 1953 and who were 18, who are in their 60s now, and who are quite sprightly and young and energetic. It had a bigger presence a few years back. It's now rather small. It's largely funded by Western foundations. It is a group of people. They do two things. They agitate for human rights in Russia, and they also have a sort of unit, a group of people who really specialize in the history of Stalinist crimes. Having said, they are tremendously good. They have tremendously good historians. They've been extremely systematic in their use of the archives. They are really the main resource for the study of this subject in Russia. Washington, D.C. Father is a lawyer. Mother worked in art museums. Yale, 1986. International relations. I spent a year at the London School of Economics. I had a Marshall Scholarship. I was there, and then I was at Oxford. I guess I left in about 1988 and moved to Warsaw. Thank you.